I believe we can start. Hello, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I see so many familiar names of friends and colleagues and students. I wish I could see all of your faces with us today. My name is Domenico Ingenito. I teach Persian literature at UCLA and I direct the program on Central Asia, which is also the official host to the Asia Pacific Center for our series of talks and panels titled Afghanistan Through Afghan Voices, Society, Literature, and the Arts, talks, conversations, readings, and visual inspirations. I'm very glad to be opening today the series of events that we have organized in collaboration with my dear colleagues and friends, Dr. Mejgan Masumi from Stanford University and Professor Arya Fani from the University of Washington. I will introduce Dr. Masumi within a couple of minutes. She will introduce, she will tell us about the breadth of this initiative. I would like to take only half minute to thank and mention all the institutions and centers and universities that are collaborating to the organization of this series, which is hosted monthly by the UCLA Program of Central Asia and co-sponsored and co-organized by the University of Washington's Persian and Iranian Studies program, Stanford University Center for South Asia, and the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies, and also the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, CMRS Center for Early Global Studies, as well as the UCLA Center for India and South Asia. I'll introduce now Dr. Mejgan Masumi, without whom we would have never been able to organize this series. Mejgan Jan, Dr. Masumi, she obtained her PhD in history from Stanford in June 2021, congratulations, with fields spanning across modern Central and South Asia and the broader Middle East. She's currently working on her forthcoming monograph, The Sounds of Kabul, Radio and the Politics of Popular Culture in Modern Afghanistan, 1960 to 79, drawing on archives in Farsi, Pashto, Tajik, Urdu, and English, and a collection of oral histories from former Radio Afghanistan employees and other producers of music and art. Her work offers a fresh perspective on Afghan history by considering the mobile and fluid international networks made possible through the producers and consumers of the radio and music in the 20th century and the centrality of the Afghan people to that story. Two forthcoming publications include an article titled Radio in Afghanistan, Resistance Through Persianate Literary Cultural Production in 2022 in a special issue of the journal Iranian Studies, and a chapter titled Radio's Internationalism in Afghanistan and Beyond in the volume South Asia Unbound. Dr. Masumi's work incorporates questions regarding technology and citizenship, transnationalism and the fluidity of identity, gender and performance, and critical approaches to global history, post-colonial studies, and sensory history. Dear Mejgan, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Domenico, for that generous introduction and passing the baton on to me. I'm truly delighted to be an organizing partner of this series and to have had the opportunity to collaborate with my colleagues from UCLA, Domenico, and the University of Washington, Arya Fani, both of whose work and scholarship are pushing their respective fields in new directions, expanding the notion of how we might think about language and literature beyond a myopic understanding or relegated geography, and to imagine other possibilities of intersection and exchange, if you will. And perhaps that's really our common ground here, that as scholars with a vested interest in the study of the past, of languages and cultures, we have moved across modern day borders and perimeters that seemingly separate the vast regions we recognize today as Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, to then look for clues, the elements that give us texture and nuance and community and connection, as well as local definitions to understand pasts and presents. And what better place than to start from the heart, the proverbial heart of Asia, the crossroads that has linked people and routes and knowledge brokers from Sufis to saints and poets to pilgrims and songs to sermons. Here we find the center, Afghanistan. What is this place and what do we know about its society, its literature, and the arts? What does this distill about what we know, or perhaps what we don't know about this part of the world? And why is that important? In the hopes of answering these questions, this series brings together some of the latest scholarship and talent in the broadly defined field of Afghanistan studies. In the recent past, the pace of scholarly production has been incredible, and its cumulative effect has transformed the study of modern Afghanistan. From historians to anthropologists, poets and literary specialists, artists, and a host of multidisciplinary scholars, we want to cultivate a space of inclusivity, scholarly exchange, and academic inspiration. I'm certainly excited for the lineup of events we have planned over the course of the next few months, and not just in the selfish pursuit of learning something about one of my own areas of scholarly interest, but to learn something more about the themes and theories that we can derive and deduce from and through Afghanistan and its lasting imprints on areas of art and literature and society. And while very important work lies ahead of us as scholars committed to distilling knowledge about ideas and people and places in their experiences, there's something that lies in front of us now. The reality of global politics that continue to shape the region, the reality of wars, and the reality of human life that is at stake every day. Some are choosing to respond to recent events as though a certain pathology has dictated the fate of Afghanistan, promoting one person on Twitter to write, "Afghanistan was once the cradle of civilization, but it has sunk into the dark ages again." And others, like my colleague Domenico Ingenito, postulate a different view, prompting him to recently tweet, and I quote, "Afghans are alive, and so are their hearts, their minds, their creativity and cultural memory. Studying Afghanistan, reading Afghanistan with Afghans and non-Afghans can be a way to recreate lost connections with the past and imagine together better futures," end quote. Lest we forget, one of the most important lessons of history is that change is inevitable, that nothing is truly permanent, and the future is unfinished, and the rest is still unwritten. Perhaps what this series and our collective conversations will cultivate out of the beating heart in the center of Asia are new paradigms, new modes of thinking, and the promise of turning a tide and presenting a new chapter in exploring who the Afghan people are and what Afghanistan is. Moving beyond the problematic colonial and neo-colonial stereotypes, the scholarship that this series highlights brings to the fore Afghans who were knowledge seekers and innovators, those who are poets and artists, lovers of language, writers of literature, singers and pathbreakers, journalists and storytellers. In the words of Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, "De Shaykh bar Chiragh hame gasht gird shar, kaz de u dad malumamo insanam arzost." A rough translation of that is, last night our guide, our Sufi master, holding an oil lamp, was roaming around town and lamenting, "I'm sick and tired of all these beasts and demons. True human beings are what I am looking for." And in the spirit of cultivating scholarship where humanity and their artistic, linguistic, and scholarly and literary talents are the focus, I would like to introduce Munaza Ibtikar, who will serve as our discussant today. Munaza is currently a doctoral candidate at Oxford University, pursuing a dissertation that combines both anthropology and history and formulates into an ethnographic study of war and memory in modern Afghanistan. She holds a master's in philosophy from the University of Oxford and completed her degrees in peace and conflict studies, as well as Middle Eastern and Near Eastern studies from the University of California at Berkeley. Having published on various open access platforms, including Ajam Media Collective, Afghan Magazine, the blog of the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, among others, Munaza has already established a thriving portfolio as a public scholar with an incredible following on Twitter. In addition to being my colleague, I am proud to say Munaza is my friend, and that what brought us together is a deep commitment to issues of justice and compassion, not just for Afghanistan, but for our world, and that perhaps through the promise of our scholarship, we can find the words to help us understand it, endure it, and articulate its multiple possibilities. And with that said, I'd like to now pass the baton to Munaza and ask her to please introduce our most esteemed guest for today, Professor Wali Ahmadi.
Thank you so much, Mujganjan. That was a very, very generous introduction. I don't want to get emotional, but it means a lot coming from a scholar like yourself. To reintroduce myself, my name is Munaza and I'm a doctoral student in Oxford. And I'm very, very happy to see this wonderful large audience, and especially happy to see some of my colleagues and friends and my doctoral supervisor, Professor Susanna Olszewska as well. I have to apologize if at any point I am out of breath. I'm unfortunately recovering from COVID-19. As this series is centered on Afghan voices and Afghan people, I first want to take a moment and pay tribute to all women and men currently fighting and resisting for their liberation, their right to life, dignity, and choice in Afghanistan. The slogans that we see emerge on social media from the country are of young activists carrying signs that read non kar va azadi, bread, work, and liberation or freedom. Unfortunately, right now, all forms of uprisings, protests, and resistances are being violently suppressed by the Taliban de facto authorities. Two young female activists, Tamanna Zaryab and Parwana Ibrahim Khail, who took part in an anti-Taliban protest, are currently in detention and their whereabouts are unknown. I pay tribute to them and to other courageous girls and women who are boycotting, protesting, and resisting under the barrels of guns. I also want to pay tribute to the hundreds and thousands of displaced Afghans who have been forced to flee their homes and live the long, painful, undignified, precarious, and uncertain life of a refugee. I believe that many of us, including myself, have been unable to put our devastation into words. As a student of Afghanistan, as I speak, the protagonists of my research are currently living under an occupation grounded on violence and oppression. We have lost our family members and friends. Some live in fear and in hiding for their gender, for their profession, for their identity, while being subject to a humanitarian crisis as the de facto authorities are sanctioned for their abhorrent crimes of the past and present. As I speak, so-called democracies and democratic governments are engaging with these de facto authorities in formal spaces, giving them the authority to speak on behalf of millions of Afghans across the world. Now, with that said, today I have the privilege and honor of introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor Wali Ahmadi. I am personally honored to make this introduction because not so long ago, I was Professor Ahmadi's undergraduate student in his History of Persian Literature class at UC Berkeley. I'm not sure if Professor Ahmadi is aware of this, but his teaching and mentorship had a profound impact on me as a young student of Afghan heritage, and I remain grateful always for his encouragement and kindness. Professor Ahmadi is chair of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at UC Berkeley, where he teaches Persian literature and literary cultural studies. Born in Kabul, he received a diploma from Lycée Istiqlal in 1982, a BA in political science from California State University, East Bay in 1987, and a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA in 1997. He is the author of Modern Persian Literature in Afghanistan, Anomalous Visions of History and Form, and the editor of Converging Zones, Persian Literary Tradition and the Writing of History. Professor Ahmadi founded and edited Naqd wa Arman, Critique and Vision, an Afghan journal of the humanities and social sciences. Dr. Ahmadi has published numerous articles in English and in Persian in leading scholarly journals. So at the end of Dr. Ahmadi's presentation, I'll open up the discussion to you, the audience, for any questions and reflections. You can write your questions on the comment box, or you can ask the question via, you can just ask it orally. So without further ado, Dr. Ahmadi, please do us the honor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very kind and generous introduction. I would like to express my gratitude to UCLA's program on Central Asia, especially to its director, my colleague, Professor Domenico Ingenito, and also to Professor Arya Farni of the University of Washington, and of course, Dr. Mishgan Masumi of Stanford, for creating this very innovative and very timely series of talks. And thanks also to Munazah. She has been great, and I really thank her for agreeing to serve as a discussant today. And I just met Aaron, and I thank him, of course, for his technical work and all the assistance that he's providing today. And let me mention at the outset that some of the points that I'm trying to present today, I have delivered elsewhere as well in other occasions. The horrific pictures of countless people at Kabul International Airport desperately trying to flee the country, coupled with images of gun-waving US Marines at the airport, captivated the world media for a couple of days in mid-August last year. A number of dramatic events had taken place in Afghanistan at the time. The chaotic evacuation of the Bagram Air Base in the darkness of the night by US troops, the rapid disintegration of the Afghan National Army and security forces, the domino-like fall of Afghan districts in cities, President Ashraf Ghani's fleeing Kabul, followed by his message on the social media, pathetically justifying his escape to save his skin, and of course, pictures of hitherto Pakistan-based and ISI-trained Taliban militias affiliated with the Haqqani network congregating at the Ag Palace in Kabul. As the chaos unfolded in Afghanistan on August 16, President Biden gave a speech defending his policy of troop withdrawal from the country. His remarks contained references to America's decade-long failed effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan, end quote. What was truly striking was that the president called a war that was started by America 2 decades earlier under the pretext of war on terror. And Biden himself, then a US senator, had actually voted to authorize, simply as Afghanistan's civil war. In other words, for 20 years, America was involved in a war that we were now told was essentially a quote, inter-Afghan conflict. And as recently as this past week, during a press conference, when the president was asked about the fiasco America's departure has left in Afghanistan, he turned the tables around and asked his journalist audience to, and I quote, Raise your hand if you think anyone was going to be able to unify Afghanistan under one single government. And obviously, no one raised their hand. He then proclaimed emphatically that, and again I quote, Afghanistan has been the graveyard of empires for a solid reason. It is not susceptible to unity, end quote. The 20 years of American involvement in Afghanistan produced very little tangible progress, I must say. Even when the US claims to have spent billions of dollars on nation building efforts in the country, Afghanistan is in dire economic situation. America left Afghanistan when the country is in the bottom of the world's social and economic indices. Currently, it is one of the least peaceful, one of the most corrupt, and one of the worst off countries in terms of human development. For President Biden, Afghanistan represents what he categorically believes to be a non-nation, a not yet nation, a still unimagined nation. As such, despite America's commitment to it, it was Afghanistan that resisted any effort towards nation building and nation engineering. Biden's comments are obviously made for political expediency. One can argue that these remarks are no less than political whitewashing of US policies, that Biden is trying to absolve himself and his administration, and indeed American policy of the past several decades from the carnage left in Afghanistan. In other words, it is pure politics. But to me, it is in fact an indicator of something much deeper. These remarks are part and parcel of a view of Afghanistan, that is, a discursive formation about matters related to Afghanistan that has long characterized Western perception of the country and dominated halls of power, the academia, the media, and is shared by a vast number of Americans and Westerners in general, whether on the left or on the right. Biden inherits this view from a predominantly Orientalist perspective on Afghanistan, a perspective that, as elaborate as it seems, is fundamentally cultural, reductionist, and essentialist. This perspective has shaped historically, but especially since the September 11, 2001, the overall tenets of the US policy towards Afghanistan. My contention here is that, on the one hand, this representation, or to be more precise, misrepresentation, coupled with the post-Cold War reigning new liberal international economic order, aka globalization, underlies US imperial and neo-colonial ambitions in Afghanistan and the region. On the other hand, looking into this discourse can help us precisely to recognize the intellectual futility, political imprudence, and strategic blunders of the overall US strategic presence in Afghanistan. The image of Afghanistan and of the Afghan society, whether in the journalistic descriptions of it in the media, in most of the serious scholarship on the country, or in the remarks made by President Biden, I just referred to, has been predominantly that of a fragmented society inhabited by wild tribes and rival ethnic groups involved in protracted inter and intra-ethnic feuds, a totally uneven community of heterogeneous people with divergent and often conflicting interests, intentions, and aspirations. Inhabitants of a benighted land, a land of extreme religiosity and religious extremism, Afghans, it is argued, are incapable of imagining themselves as a cohesive society, a nation in the real sense. They cannot and therefore ought not to narrate themselves as a nation, for they cannot be but a fabricated whole, a constructed scheme, an artificial entity with plastic boundaries and flexible borders. A recently arranged patchwork of semi-nations with divergent traditions, with little common history and coherent culture to hold on to, and even lesser hopes to look forward to the future. Hence, Biden's remarks that anyone who attempts to engage with Afghanistan as a unified country will definitely fail. This representation of Afghanistan has been largely derived from the 19th century British engagements with the country, ever since it emerged as a crucial space in the British colonial reconquest of the Indian subcontinent and the ensuing Great Game with Tsarist Russia. The country inhabited by fierce Mohammedans belonging to a myriad of wild tribes, the country has earned the reputation of being the graveyard of empires, the unconquerable land, the arena of constant and devastating wars and conflicts, inter-ethnic rivalries, religious extremism, poverty, and economic deprivation. Precisely because of the endurance of this, what appears to them as a fact, it is claimed that Afghans, as an Orientalist species, have a natural tendency to resort to violence, often pointing to the natural ferocity, which at times is praised as valor. Implicit in the culture of Afghanistan, it is suggested in a purely reductionist way that if there is no foreign enemy to fight against, the Afghans turn against each other. The Pashtuns versus the Tajiks versus the Uzbeks versus the Hazaras, and the Hazaras versus everybody else. Since the Afghan is characterized to be naturally prone to fighting, the argument goes, the Afghan society is essentially a society in constant state of warfare. In the past, as in the present, as Biden's remarks I referred to earlier indicate, whatever conquering empires, the US most recently, attempt to pacify Afghanistan, their efforts fail and they find themselves in a quagmire because there is no unified country called Afghanistan to be neatly and methodically pacified. For Biden, all we have under the construct Afghanistan is a 19th century colonial patching up of a haphazardly drawn political entity and no more. Consequently, Afghanistan by definition remains both unconquerable but also ungovernable, simply a most inhospitable place for foreigners to occupy. And this inhospitality makes Afghanistan an exceptional case within the accepted nation-state paradigmatic structure. In other words, Afghanistan becomes a historical anomaly. And as such, other countries, normal countries like the United States, ought to resort to exceptional measures in dealing with it. Thus, as an anomalous state, it can be treated exceptionally. It can be promised democracy and free elections, and its people can be asked to exercise their electoral power. But when the people risk their lives to form long lines to vote, and in many cases even lose their thumbs for exercising this fundamental power, they end up under the very nose of imperial international observers, getting utterly rigged elections and corrupt political leaders, thus undermining any belief in genuine democracy. It can be said to finally enjoy development and security, but can also turn into a laboratory for experimenting the latest American machinery of war. It can provide an excellent case of draconian free market economics required by the World Bank and IMF, but then it can also be allowed to have a most corrupt institution masquerading as the Afghan state to restrict the free enterprise in favor of a kleptocratic system. It can be the place where fake missionary feminism advocates emancipation of Afghan women, yet when the very forces whose raison d'etre is in part to deny women their basic rights are back in charge, they would either placate these forces or simply remain silent in the face of anti-women tsunami unleashed by the Taliban. It can be a place where America can put Siraj Haqqani, the notorious head of the Haqqani terror network, responsible for countless terrorist attacks against civilians in Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan, on FBI's wanted list, or most wanted list, with a $10 million reward. And exactly at the same time, the CIA director, William Burns, visit Kabul secretly and meet with this very terrorist leader who is now the interior minister, and the Taliban cabinet. And finally, Afghanistan is a country that can be liberated in 2001 from the claws of Taliban terrorism, be subjected to a fantastic scheme of nation building for years, and can eventually be delivered in 2021 right back into the lap of the same terror organization. The Orientalist discourse on Afghanistan I've been talking about so far underlies the widely held view, repeated also in the remarks of President Biden, that traces the failure of the American involvement in the country to the historical and cultural propensity of Afghans to resist social cohesiveness and their violent reaction to modern progress and their antagonism towards change. I propose that the complicated situation prevalent in Afghanistan in the wake of American withdrawal of troops has been a direct consequence of an array of political and economic reasons that are not necessarily reducible to the traits inherent in the Afghan culture or the activities and decisions of the Afghan people. Rather, what we witness today has been inevitably and inexorably connected to the often destructive role conflicting policy goals and short-sighted tactical and strategic intentions of foreign powers, especially the US. Because of time limitations, I don't wish to dwell on how America was complicit in the rise of the Mujahideen Islamic parties in the 1980s when the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, and how it helped Pakistani ISI to define the anti-Soviet war of liberation mainly as a religious war, a jihad. I also don't want to go in details about American financial interests and complicity in the initial rise of the Taliban movement in the mid-1990s as an alternative to the warring factions of the Mujahideen who had utterly destroyed the country. I would start with the defining events of 9/11. It was then that the neocon elements in George Bush's administration, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Bolton, and tacitly, of course, Dick Cheney, were all out for a muscular response to the perpetrators of these incidents. The empire struck, and it struck mightily. Within weeks, the Taliban were on flight. In the immediate aftermath of the US occupation of Afghanistan in 2002, American policymakers started to consider the newly occupied Afghanistan as important not only in terms of fighting war on terror, but also because it could serve as a laboratory for experimenting with political engineering in the name of nation building. The latter turned into a fundamental thesis of American logic of war. For Afghans, from the very early on, however, American commitment to both of these objectives, war on terror and nation building, seemed far less than total. At least since 2006, when the Taliban insurgency started to resurface as a security challenge to the Afghan state and its international sponsors, it was obvious that the so-called war on terror was fought in the wrong arena. In other words, Afghanistan was itself a victim of terrorism. Terrorist sanctuaries, financial hubs, and military training centers were outside of Afghanistan in Pakistani territory, to be precise. If the American war on terror had a chance not to turn itself into a catastrophic debacle, it had to seriously deal with the perpetrators of terror across the border and not victims of terror campaign in the villages of Afghanistan. As more Afghans lost their lives and more US soldiers perished in what became America's longest war, the insurgency became increasingly stronger in the sanctuaries and training camps of the Taliban, and their affiliated terrorist offshoots such as the Haqqani group were ever flourishing across the border. And Taliban had huge financial stakes in the Gulf states, especially in Qatar and the Emirates. Why the US policymakers failed to see that the theater of war was not in Afghanistan or should not be in Afghanistan? Why throughout many years it insisted on fighting the wrong enemy, so to speak? Why didn't it target the financial sources of Taliban insurgency? So much for the American commitment to the war on terror. As for the project of nation building, it became obvious from the onset that the so-called democratic system that was placed in Kabul proved itself a mockery of democracy. Post-Taliban US-occupied Afghanistan, instead of becoming more democratic as it was supposed to in theory, in practice regressed into a radically and dangerously polarized, divided polity where anti-democratic, autocratic, and even fascistic elements with narrow ideological, ethnic, linguistic, and regional affinities were on the rise. True that under American occupation, elections, whether presidential or parliamentary, were staged, but it was evident also that those elections were systematically rigged. Not that Afghans did not want to participate in the democratic experiment. In the presidential elections of 2009 and 2014, long lines were formed by ordinary people, men and women, young and old, who dared to vote, knowing full well that the Taliban would target those whose colored thumbs were indicative of the fact that they had actually voted. And elections were not limited to Kabul or big cities. Even in the faraway corners and the provinces, people were risking their lives to take part in elections. The 2009 elections were contentious, but the 2014 one proved disastrous, thus seriously undermining the democratic procedure right under the direct supervision of the US Embassy. After months of wrangling over the inconclusive results, it took John Kerry, the Secretary of State for Mr. Obama, to travel to Kabul and literally appoint one candidate as the elected president and create a new office of chief executive for his rival. So much so for democracy, civil society, elections, rule of law, the slogans of American project of nation building. As the elections of 2019, however, showed, the Afghan belief in democracy, therefore, was radically shaken, and the order America had imposed in Afghanistan was about to implode. The enterprise of nation building had proven itself more of a mirage, a fantastic case of nation unraveling and nation wrecking. It will be naive to assume that America, the colonial imperial domination or dominion that oversaw and literally controlled every single development in the country, was not aware that instead of becoming a democratic country, Afghanistan was morphed into a radically and dangerously polarized and socially combustible polity, all at the time that the country needed to grapple with the tenacious machine of Taliban terror from across the border in Pakistan. Equally importantly, if only more destabilizing, has been the introduction in the war-battered society of a ruthless neoliberal economic order backed by hegemonic global capital and its closely affiliated financial and political ideological institutions. The preferred practical mechanisms whose ideological undertone can hardly be concealed, are said to function most effectively in conditions of free enterprise, of market economy, and of increasing privatization and deregulation, the usual neoliberal mantra of US hegemony in the non-Western world. Since the imposition of this economic order after the American invasion, in a society that is still practically in a state of war, reconstruction efforts had been largely bungled and the infrastructure has remained shuttered. The most visible indication of how billions of dollars of international aid are being spent on the reconstruction of the country, one can only point to the building of ostentatious towers, elaborate wedding halls, and spacious houses on the land forcibly seized from the poor by old warlords and new elites returning from the West. The drug trade continued, the black market expanded rapidly, and unemployment remained staggering. The rampant corruption and graft at every level of the government generated and is complemented by increasing poverty, the further shrinking of the already diminished middle class, continuing uneven distribution of resources, and endemic environmental decline and degradation. The Afghan youth, the very group that should embody most manifestly the supposed achievement of the US imposed democratic order, started leaving the country in droves, undertaking precarious journeys across continents and dangerous seas, seeking relative safety and opportunities elsewhere. The money earmarked by the US government for Afghanistan's nation building efforts in Kabul were lost in a vicious cycle of inefficiency, corruption, deceit, and money laundering. The cancer of systematic, methodic corruption had affected every single fiber of the new state. The more visibly money was spent, the more invisible the end product would become. As soon as one observer mentions, the post-American invasion Afghan government were, or governments, I should say, self-organized into a kleptocracy. That undermined the post-2002 strategy of building a state that could outlast the occupation. Petty corruption is like skin cancer. There are ways to deal with it, and you'll probably be fine. Corruption within ministries and higher level is like colon cancer. It is worse, but if you can't catch it on time, you're probably okay. Kleptocracy, on the other hand, is like brain cancer. It is fatal. And it proves fatal in the case of Afghanistan. It will be disingenuous to claim that the sidestepping of democratic rule, the heightening of ethnic tribal tensions, widespread human rights abuses, large-scale corruption, weakening of state institutions, etc., that is the multitude of practices that clearly undermine the creation of a viable, functioning democracy in Afghanistan had not been noticed by the US. All one has to do is to access the various reports gathered by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, which has been the US government's leading oversight authority on Afghanistan since 2008, in fact, to find out exactly how knowledgeable consecutive US administrations were about the fundamental structural problems and worsening situation in Afghanistan, and how stubbornly they resisted taking serious, meaningful steps to correct the course of action there. Post 9/11 Afghanistan's economic structure, which has been heavily subsidized by the US and such organizations as IMF and the World Bank, can best be described as primitive, peripheral capitalism. A peculiar characteristic of this primitive capitalism under colonial and semi-colonial conditions in imperial occupation was the NGOization of the economy. In theory, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, refer to aid organizations in the global south that receive what would appear to be free money from the international, typically European or American, aid industry to accomplish the construction projects, including cultural and educational projects. After the American occupation of Afghanistan, numerous NGOs rushed into Afghanistan and a huge funding game for donors started. With little accountability requirements, these institutions penetrated nearly every layer of the civil society. Terms such as project, funding, grant, aid, application, etc., became common Afghan household terms, even among those who knew no English. The NGOs contributed to an artificial sense of economic development in the country. In reality, the NGOization of Afghan organizations produced dependency. Caught in the complex wave of foreign aid, Afghan organizations were never taught to act creatively and independently. They were simply Western finance groups orphaned the moment that the US wrapped its mission in Kabul and left for the door. In any case, NGOism, the liberal free market economic policy ordered by Washington and adopted by Afghanistan's financial elites and monetary bureaucrats in 2002 and beyond, represent a new orientation in a society which will historically relied on a state-owned or mixed public-private enterprise. Many Afghans recall, however imperfectly, the pre-Soviet invasion era when the state created factories, infrastructure, and other job-creating modern assets. After the American invasion of 2001, there was an expectation on the part of many Afghans that the new US-supported state would again be active in the economic sphere. That expectation was not met because capitalism had evolved into its new liberal phase. where the Keynesian liberal capitalist state was no longer fashionable in its Euro-American core. And so it was denied also in the periphery. If the new liberal order was reducing the role of the state in the society and was cutting social services left and right in America itself, it would be foolhardy to expect the American imperial order in Afghanistan to have the Afghan state offer such social services to its people. Let's move on. If the Orientalist perception of Afghanistan underlied the occupation of Afghanistan in the first place in 2001, in a curious way, it also underlies the American decision to disengage itself from the country in 2021. Motivated by the Orientalist discursive discourse about Afghan and Afghanistan, Trump started Doha talks and got the Taliban out of the terror list indefinitely. With Taliban pledging not to attack America and American interests, the US had little more to be concerned about. In what can only be said to be a deal, America saw its chance to easily trade horses, dump its old, corrupt, inept client state in Kabul for a new ally, the Taliban. This should not seem too unusual, for the US had had a long history of engaging productively with right-wing, extremist religious entities elsewhere, the Islamic world included. Mullahs may express their discontent towards what they perceive to be the lax moral codes in the West, but they have a very soft spot when it comes to capital, and they cannot resist the mystical power of money. America never thought of radical Islam as an enemy, a thorn on the side, but not an enemy, so long as it posed no real threat to capitalism. Taliban can be reconciled. They can be successfully co-opted. I wouldn't be surprised if in not too distant future, we'll see the free world engage with Taliban, notwithstanding their terrorist past. In fact, only a couple of days ago, Norway hosted a high delegation of Taliban leaders, which US Special Representative for Afghanistan also attended. Notions of democracy promotion, human rights, women's education, press freedom, that constituted the discursive core of American engagement with Afghanistan in the past 20 years can be conveniently put aside. With the now deposed Ghani government, America was too much preoccupied in putting money into Afghanistan rather than getting the chance to get money out of it. Therefore, it is time for America to cut its losses, make a deal with the Taliban, pull the rug from under the feet of the very government the US established 20 years earlier, dismantle the Afghan army, abandon the modicum of democratic institutions in the country, and allow the Taliban to return to power in Afghanistan. This is how the American mission in Afghanistan got accomplished. Two factors, however, in my view, convinced the US imperial order to change its horses in Afghanistan. One, as I've pointed out earlier, the failure of America to create a modicum of a functioning state and efficient bureaucracy in Afghanistan. And this failure was, to a large extent, self-inflicted. And two, the periodic crisis of capitalism, as exemplified by the epic meltdown of the economy in America in 2008, an event that convinced US leaders that while wars can be enormously financially beneficial to certain groups, America, and NATO for that matter, needed to extricate itself from fighting expensive foreign wars with negligible rate of profit that may seriously jeopardize American global hegemony. The repercussion of economic crisis of 2008 on American military occupation of Afghanistan could not be underestimated. Only after this massive financial crisis, the elites in Washington, including Joe Biden, who had just been elected vice president and the ticket with Barack Obama, started to question the validity of America's endless war and forever war. Not before it. So it is crucial to contextualize this aspect of American involvement in Afghanistan. In many ways, the start of American abandonment of its client regime in Kabul started from the time of this development. The Doha Agreement with the Taliban a decade later simply provided a terror network the opportunity to publicly emerge on a par with the patron of the very regime it was fighting against. The fate of the Kabul administration and of Afghanistan was sealed the moment Khalilzad and Mullah Baradar, the head of the Taliban political bureau in Qatar, signed a peace document. To conclude, in the spirit of some other contemporary political figures, Barack Obama for one, the Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, just released his 2021 Spotify playlist, basically his end of the year favorite songs. He has a at-home compilation of American songs and on the road selection inspired by places he had visited over the past year. The on the road list includes 36 selections, highlighting artists from different regions of the world. In the list, there is a song, Nafasam, by the Afghan woman pop singer Ariana Saeed. As Mr. Blinken is enjoying the music of Ms. Saeed, who had attended receptions at the US Embassy in Kabul before and is well known in the corridors of power there, and perfectly embodies what I call the marketization of art in the era of American hegemony in Afghanistan, young Afghan women and girls are anxiously awaiting Taliban mullahs to decide their future, to decide whether women have the very basic right to attend the schools come spring or not. As Mr. Blinken enjoys his favorite music in Afghanistan, however, the cycle of violence continues and the wheel of death and destruction spins with ever more speed. Dark days are here and darker days are on the horizon. And Mr. Blinken keeps enjoying his playlist as if America had nothing to do with the situation in Afghanistan. In a not too distant future, America's longest war may turn into a forgotten war in the United States. In Afghanistan, however, this traumatic engagement with the most powerful democracy in the history of the world, as we are told, will long be remembered with bitterness and a feeling of utter betrayal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmadi, for your really wonderful and insightful talk. We have a lot to discuss, I believe. Before we open the floor for questions, I have a few questions myself. Dr. Ahmadi, I understand the importance of theoretical frameworks in our work. But as a student of anthropology, sometimes I want to learn more on the limitations in our knowledge or understanding, especially in Anglophone work. So critical scholars seek to understand Afghanistan, usually within broad frameworks and theoretical understandings, but there is insufficient effort, in your words, on having serious scholarship on Afghanistan. So voices, histories, knowledge, experiences that complicate or push further these ways of understanding and these unquestioned discourses. So I often ask myself, for how long will scholars, especially scholars of Afghan heritage, are required to debunk myths and stereotypes? So Professor Ahmadi, my question is, do we face limitations in our scholarship when we are busy debunking myths and stereotypes and what has become universal truths about the country and the people? And what does serious scholarship on Afghanistan look like in practice? What does speaking truth to power look like in practice in our scholarship? How do we take serious the urgency and the seriousness of our interlocutors and research protagonists when we work on Afghanistan? What about the moral commitment in our work on Afghanistan? Sorry, those were too many questions. I have another question, but go ahead, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you. I mean, these are really fundamental questions. I've been tackling these issues myself for so long. I think it's a Herculean job. It's not an easy one, for scholars of Afghan descent or Afghan scholars in general to debunk this. There's always a danger of falling back into what I would call a nativist perspective, which is as limiting as the dominant hegemonic scholarship or discourse on Afghanistan suggests. So I would really seriously warn our colleagues from falling back into the sort of like the nationalist, nativist kind of reading of Afghan history and Afghan society, which could be equally as dangerous as the dominant hegemonic views of Afghanistan in the West. One thing that I think we should think about now is to what I would call de-learning imperialist visions of Afghanistan. By de-learning imperialism, I would like to suggest that at least for the last 20 years, and perhaps even the previous 20 years, Afghanistan has been in war for over 40 years now, 42, 43 years now. We have been pretty much captivated by a view of ourselves that has been not really our own views, basically. And we have been repeating things about Afghanistan that have been pretty much serving interests that are clearly hegemonic, imperial. And as I said, most of what we think of Afghanistan today, even among Afghans themselves, just follow the social media today. We are really, really repeating what we have been told by the American media. I mean, this constant ethnicization of Afghan conflict, this constant regionalization of Afghan conflict, as if Afghanistan is not in a society where people live and people dwell on things other than these matters. The economy is important. People want to have food on the table at the end of the day, and irrespective of what ethnicity or group you come from, those things are pretty much forgotten. What I would suggest is that this imperial or imperially dominant views of Afghanistan need to be questioned. Not only questioned, but in fact de-learned, as I said, And in the meantime, we need to come up not with a nativist perspective on Afghan affairs, but with a view that looks at the subaltern as the common Afghan, rather than this elite nationalist reading of Afghan history from the top, or the imperialist reading of Afghan history and society from the outside. As I said, it's not an easy task, and it's for the young generation of scholars like yourself to work on that. And I think that it is going to be a very difficult task, but it can be. It's doable. It can be, as long as we have. But I do agree with you that the theoretical frameworks that they have been working on so far, and in many ways, have been really repetitions of what we have been told by this imperially generated views on scholarship on Afghanistan, which need to be retaught.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
And I think there was another thing that you also. Yeah, I'm sorry. So go ahead. You said you had another question as well.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for that answer, Dr. Ahmadi. I really enjoyed the way in which you touched upon Orientalism and knowledge production. We know that Orientalism borrows from Foucault's knowledge and power, or largely borrows from Foucault's knowledge and power. I'm particularly interested in decentered modes of knowledge production, basically the spaces and places and people consulted in regards to knowledge produced on Afghans and Afghanistan. And you've mentioned this in your talk. We know that think tanks and policymakers are complicit in the destructive knowledge of the country and the United States' devastating foreign policy. We saw in real time over the years the ways in which or the shift in US policy towards Afghanistan and how that was supported by these knowledge brokers, basically these think tanks that are largely based in DC. So Zalmay Khalilzad himself was affiliated with the RAND Corporation. So some of us were too young to remember the events of 2001, but we have read in the works of authoritative scholars of Afghanistan the sudden demand and urgency of producing knowledge on Afghanistan. when the US-led forces went into the country. And we're seeing that again since August 15th. We are witness to, in the last few months, our colleagues, friends, scholars who focus on Afghanistan being repeatedly asked to help make sense of the country and its people. Dr. Ahmadi, do you see a different type of knowledge being produced on Afghanistan than the early 2000s in scholarship in light of the current circumstances? Have these knowledge brokers on Afghanistan, have they shifted? Has knowledge shifted on Afghanistan since the US-led coalition forces have left the country?
Well, this is an excellent question. It's a bit difficult to answer as well, but I want to be optimistic about that, to tell you the truth. I think we have, perhaps because of the availability of social media and these organizations here and there, now a one particularly produced form of knowledge, the kind that people like Khalilzad, for instance, or even Ashraf Ghani himself, I mean, we must admit, I mean, he's a scholar, and he wrote on Afghanistan, he published on Afghanistan, but at the time that not many others were working on topics related to Afghanistan, but now, I mean, there's groups of very enthusiastic, very I would say engaging and energetic young scholars all over that are producing works on Afghanistan from different angles and different perspectives, and sometimes in conflict with each other, which is good, actually. We don't have to, all of us, to think alike and produce the same kind of work. But at least in terms of the production of knowledge about Afghanistan, we have alternative ways of dealing with such matters. Your own work, for instance, I mean, I've read your writings and the work of some of the other younger Afghan scholars, which really makes us optimistic about the fact that perhaps there is a change. It's still not a change that I would like, to see, but I think we're on the right track, and we can look at our own past as the scholars of Afghanistan more critically, and hopefully look forward to a more productive engagement with matters related to Afghanistan as such. So even though I cannot really be too optimistic, but I think there are reasons to think that things are shifting and changing for the better.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmadi. The optimism is, it's really great to leave this with the optimism.
I believe in when I mean that idea, that the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, that Gramsci suggested, and I think I would like to prescribe to that idea, that I know things are so crashingly bad, all around us, and you hear the news from Afghanistan, and the world of scholarship is also in tatters, in the country, but because there's nothing going on right now. I mean, schools are all shut, universities are all shut, and in many ways, so you don't see anything happening. But it doesn't mean that we should just give up. So as at the beginning of the presentations today, Mishkan so beautifully said, I mean, there are people there, and people are whether we like it or not, whether we like everything we hear or not, they're there, and they're producing, they're working, and they're doing fascinating work, that we are not aware of now. There's another issue, of course, but we still need to be optimistic of the fact that yes, things are happening and happening for the better, I hope. Yeah, I'm sorry that I interrupted you.
No, thank you so much. I think we all really needed to hear that, myself especially. Dr. Mausumi, would you like to read questions from the chat box, or should I do that?
Yeah, you can. I don't see anything in the chat box just yet, but to get us started, I have a question I'd love to pose to Professor Ahmadi, but I would just like to thank you, Ustad, for these excellent comments, so much food for thought, and incredible critique. I really appreciate your comments. I suppose long before I became an informal student of yours, Ustad, in my house, this wonderful journal circulated called Naqd wa Arman. And in autumn of 1996 and spring of 1997, the editor's comments from you were very, very insightful. And I'd like to just quote out of that a little bit. You've written, the publication of this issue coincides with the rapid changes taking place inside Afghanistan. The military success of the Taliban over the former divided and disunited Mujahideen groups throughout the country poses an important challenge to the student of Afghanistan history and society. That an obscure group virtually unknown 3 years ago could ascend to political supremacy using an obscurationist agenda needs to be explained and analyzed historically. No such analysis, however, can be undertaken unless the role of ideology and ideological apparatuses in this process is seriously acknowledged and critically addressed. The rather facile explanation that emphasizes ethnic, regional, and linguistic diversity of Afghan society as the underlying cause of many complex and multifaceted effects is both simplifying and simplistic. Furthermore, what is significant is also to investigate the enormous implications and consequences current political developments have for Afghan culture and literature. Now, this passage, this all sounds eerily familiar to the current moment. In public discourse, there's been an interesting vocabulary produced to describe the Taliban of the past, designating the Taliban of the 1990s as Taliban 1.0 versus the Taliban of today as 2.0. In your view, has the ideology changed? Are we dealing with similar problems? Or is something else brewing here? I appreciated your metaphors of cancer. So if this is one, what's the prognosis, Ustad?
That's fascinating, actually, the question they're asking. And thank you also for coding, that introduction that I wrote to one of the issues of the magazine. As far as the Afghan people, well, see, the thing is that we constantly talk about Taliban changing, or Taliban changed now versus a changing Taliban from the Taliban 1.0, as you said. I would like to ask that question not to policymakers in the corridors of the State Department, not the Khalilzads and Tom Wests and this and that, and I would like to ask the Afghan people what they think. And I think what I hear from sources in Afghanistan and also reading about Afghanistan all over, I don't think that the Afghan people think that there's been any change in the way the Taliban are working and acting. And it also tells us something else, though, that the 20 years of war in Afghanistan was not really a war to destabilize, if not destroy, the Taliban. I think in many ways it was, see, there's something that has been in the back of my mind. Look at the Taliban leadership today. You see almost exactly the same names that we heard 21, 22 years ago as the leaders. Of course, I mean, when you see the pictures, then they were not allowed to show their pictures, but now we see the pictures, beards are a little bit grayer and bellies are bigger and they look bulkier. But except for Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader of theirs, and a couple of others, on the top, the rest of them are all the same men. Mullah this and Mullah that, and Akhund this and Akhund that. They're all as if nothing has changed, which makes you think that, so who did we go after in the past 20 years? If the leadership was there, and remained intact, who were the ones who? So we basically, they went after perhaps some rank and file, disaffected people who joined the Taliban in the villages or in the countryside. Yes, but the leadership is still there, and it makes you think that, and they have not changed. I mean, when you hear of the one thing, of course, is the world of media has changed. Social media is now pretty much dominant, and so they cannot go and play the same game as they used to, shutting out the media in general. I think the leadership of the Taliban today are a bit wiser, and they're savvier in how to deal with matters. But all in all, I think in reality, you don't see any tangible change coming from the Taliban, and you cannot expect that either. And if you think that the world, the outside world, can engage with them, as the Norwegian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister were saying, to me, it's really not working because of the fact that if the Taliban change as they would like them to, then they will not be Taliban anymore. And if they don't change, I think they know for sure, as they have been in the last 20 years, waiting on the side, that the outside world, especially the so-called democratic, free world, they will come back and engage with them. I think they're very savvy in that regard. In the last 20 years, if America could come back and deal with us in this way, then of course the rest of the European countries, Norway, Sweden, those places will come too. And so to me, I think that's something that we need to. Unless of course we get out of this framework that has brought us all in this kind of situation in the first place, get out of the box, the Orientalist box that reads Afghanistan, as I said, throughout the paper today, and so that becomes the most important point so far for us. How to, and also of course bringing in the Afghans in that equation. What do they think? But unfortunately, with the present situation in Afghanistan, with the Taliban being the dominant group, the voices of the Afghans are pretty much shut out, and we don't hear much, except of course in the social media.
Thank you so much,
Dr. Ahmadi.
Oh, please.
Sorry, Mushkanjan. I just wanted to emphasize on the point that Dr. Ahmadi made, which was the Taliban and them changing. What we know for a fact is that the presence of NATO and the United States in recent years have actually strengthened the Taliban. We know that the Taliban extorted money from private security companies to prevent them from being attacked. So from 2009 to 2016, Americans relied on nearly 200,000 contracted private personnel who had private financial dealings with the Taliban. And this is like in addition to, engaging with the Taliban in formal spaces for years, and then having these think tanks produce all sorts of policy papers. And I'm sure we have many more examples of that sort. But the Taliban have changed, but not in the way that, they tell us.
Exactly. And this is exactly, Monaza, is the point that I'm trying to make, is that this is a classic case. When Biden talks about Afghanistan and in August last year, and also just this past week, it's a classic case of blaming the victim. Really. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, all of these matters. You know how these things evolved in Afghanistan the last 20 years. You're so intimately involved in the country. And now, as you see the situation, basically as catastrophic as it is, then you say, well, it's the Afghans who basically deserve this. I mean, it's their own making. I mean, I did my best. It's their history. It's their all. I mean, they cannot be unified. They're people just in constant state of war. And I did my best, but obviously they don't deserve it. And here I'm walking out. But at the point that you're making, it is not that easy, because in the making of the situation as it is today, this is not the making of the Afghan people. America, 20 years of American imperial adventure in Afghanistan is directly related to what we are today. But then again, for the, as I said, for American policymakers, that's secondary. Well, it's the Afghans to be blamed for. So yeah, I mean, you do your part to destroy the country, and you leave, and you then blame the victim themselves for their victimhood.
Exactly. Dr. Ahmadi, one interesting thing, one dominant narrative that we've been hearing on Afghans in Afghanistan in the past few months has been Afghans themselves are not fighting, so why should we care, right? Afghans are at fault for everything, and they stopped fighting. But I conducted my field work in 2019, and I remember being among Afghan women, and they would hold meetings with each other on not sending their boys to go fight. Why? Because they, on one hand, they would have their sons and members of their family come in tombs into their village.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you have Donald Trump or whoever else engaging formally with the Taliban. The enemy became unknown, and you're not fighting for the government. You don't know who the enemy is anymore. Why? Because your so-called allies are engaging formally with them. Why should you risk your life for a cause that that makes no sense? It's completely been obscured. Just to emphasize and add on to just providing my own just kind of examples during my fieldwork in Afghanistan.
It's a very valid point. Definitely, I think it's a very valid point that you're making. Look at this. I teach. Most of us here also teach. If you see one of your students not in the classroom, or somebody whose name is there, registered for the class, and never shows up, what do? You inquire about it. Where is this person? And if not, perhaps that person should drop the course. Now, President Biden, in August 16 last year, he says that we helped the creation of an well-equipped 300,000 strong Afghan army. But then again, SIGAR itself, the committee the investigative institution there in the State Department, it says that, well, most of the Afghan army soldiers were ghost soldiers. They were not there. So you feel like since 2014, when Obama decided to withdraw American troops, the bulk of them, and American presence in Afghanistan was basically reduced to assist and train, if you're an American trainer for a 300,000 strong Afghan army, and you see that only a fraction of those people show up in classroom, isn't it your responsibility to ask why? Where are the rest of them? So in a sense, it really reflects the I would say the ineptitude of the trainer, rather than the absence of the deliberate or otherwise of the trainee. And and your point is well taken. And whatever is there, and especially when Khalilzad is making all these claims in Doha about, well, war is not the answer, and why should there be a war, and we should all opt for a political solution to the problem, which is fine. But at the same time, you say that, well, the Afghan army did not fight, so why should we? Well, the army of Afghanistan didn't fight because you're basically sending all these conflicting signals. And as you said, no mother anywhere in Afghanistan as elsewhere would like to see a knock on the door and the coffin of the dead son coming for a cause that we don't know what it is for. So it's an absolutely valid point that you're making. Yes, definitely.
We do have a number of questions coming through into the Q&A. Domenico, did you want to start or read some of the questions there?
Marjan Wardaki had a question first. I will follow, and then I think Professor Arya-Fani also had a question, and then I can ask mine.
Oh, please go ahead, and you can read out of the Q&A.
Actually, since we have Dr. Wardaki here with us, maybe if she could unmute herself and ask the question. And in interest of putting our audience first, I will not ask my question. Dr. Wardaki, please.
Can you all hear me okay, though? I don't have, okay, wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much to the organizers. It is mostly thank you to Professor Ahmadi for that wonderful talk. I suppose just one of the questions that popped in my head as you were talking about sort of Afghanistan from the outsider's perspective, looking at it from these ambivalent US policies, I'm just really curious if you could talk a little bit about, kind of capture the heterogeneous views within Afghanistan. I think that surprisingly to me, there seems to be a little sort of an element of Afghans who actually support the Taliban. How can we explain that? And is that perhaps, just to add to the conversation, is that the important change we see from the previous, Taliban 0.1 or 1, you know? So I'm just curious about if you could just address that. Thank you.
Oh, it's so wonderful to see you, at least see your picture, Majan. I mean, we've been in touch, but I haven't really met you personally, but that's great. And you're really posing a very fundamental question. I think one of the reasons that Afghans, at least certain segments of Afghan society, are supportive of the Taliban goes back to the history of the last 20 years. That the failed American involvement in the country. It really, when you see the alternative being a corrupt Ghani government, theoretically supported by the United States until a year or two ago, and then the Taliban, about whom you know to a large extent, but at the same time, you think that perhaps it could be a better alternative than the Ghani government. So there are certain groups and elements who would be a bit more positively thinking about the Taliban. But all in all, I think it's not because of the actions and deeds of the Taliban, but precisely because of the way the American-supported administration of Ghani and Karzai treated the people and how they were implementing their policies in the country, how corrupt they were, and how insensitive to the needs of the Afghan people. That's the main reason that people or certain group of people, certain segments of the people in Afghanistan are thinking positively about the Taliban, not because of the Taliban themselves. So that's my way of looking at it. And we don't know, with the passing of time, we'll see. Even now, I mean, you could say that certain elements that were originally a bit more supportive are now having some second thoughts, and that perhaps this is not also what we should be looking for in the country. So that will be again, as I said, it's don't look at what the Taliban do, but what the previous government did to Afghans. It was so much responsible for the sustenance of the Taliban as a group, and for the war, for the continuation of war, and also for the fact that certain segments in Afghan society became supportive of the people that are really the tormentor of the people. Really, I mean, it's just that. But since there's no other alternative at the moment, then obviously that's where we end up.
Thank you, Alijan. Thank you for that answer.
Arya, you had a question.
I'd like to read the audience questions in the interest of putting them first. There's a question by Sasha Schneider. Good to see you, Sasha. Thank you for coming. If most issues can be seen as follow the money, how can we determine what is actually happening in Afghanistan?
Follow the money, basically. That's what it is, and as it was before, as it is now. Really, it's just like I think one of the things that we think of the situation in Afghanistan is that it's only a military matter. It's the Taliban versus the opposition, or the Taliban fighting the Americans until last year, and so on and so forth. But I think that really evades it begs the question that perhaps it's not as simple as that. And the Taliban today, part of the commitment that they made with America is that perhaps the question of profits, the question of financial incentives has always been crucial to the Taliban. And I think one of the reasons that there's so much going around and trying to unfreeze the Afghan assets, and it's because they need the money, and if they can get it one way or another, that's fine with them. And I think that they are soon. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in not too distant future, American companies are reopening branches in Kabul. I mean, just think about it. Under the Ghani government, the insecurity in the countryside would not let companies to go and explore their financial assets there. Now with the Taliban, if they can bring safety and security to those regions, without even engaging America militarily with Afghanistan, we could perhaps get a lot more out of Afghanistan that we put in, versus the Ghani government, which was the opposite. So yeah, follow the money basically, and the Taliban are very good at that. I think they were very adroit in that. They've always been. The Taliban 1.0. I mean, they were all over Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Qatar. The Taliban 2.0 again. I mean, now they're very much invested in many parts of the Gulf states, and they get a lot of money from there, and they would not mind at all if they could also get into some sort of financial contracts with the Americans. I think that's their aim, and for good reasons. They think that they might become successful in that.
Thank you for that answer, Professor Ahmadi. There's a question that wasn't posted to Q&A, but it was sent to the panelists that I'd like to ask Dr. David Chaffetz. And the question is, what are the counter narratives, especially given that this is a public facing talk and there's many members of the public attending? What are some novels, non-academic works, cinematic, cultural, artistic, for our English language audience that you would recommend that would counter this Orientalist framework within which Afghanistan is usually discussed?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think just looking at the list of the talks that that you guys are working on, for the subsequent congregations of this or conferences or forums, I think they'll be more explored later on. But from the top of my mind, I think I would think of a couple of really good translations of the work of the Afghan filmmaker and writer in France, Atiq Rahimi, for instance. I think it's a wonderful array of works. They're really good, and I mean, to give us a sort of a not necessarily counter narrative, but at least a different narrative of what's going on. His work is really fascinating. If you could read them in the original, of course, that would be even better. But if not, translations are good too. In the work of Afghan writers inside Afghanistan, one thing that we must remember is that in the last 20 years or so, if everything else was going downwards, one thing that I was really optimistic about, and I think it really was very productive in many ways, was the writing of fiction and poetry in Afghanistan. So many young writers and poets have emerged in the last 20 years. Fascinating works are coming out of there. But unfortunately, again, a good number of those people, very aspiring writers and poets, are now either left the country under very dire circumstances. They are now refugees in Turkey or in France or in Germany and really in a limbo, or here in America. This is something, and it takes really a lot of time for a writer or a poet to establish himself or herself in a situation where they could become productive again. So this is another thing, a narrative that we hear from the so-called Good Samaritans in America is that, well, let's open up the doors to Afghan refugees to come. It is not that simple. You cannot just leave a history behind. We have been, I mean, most of us here, we came to America at the time that the Soviets were invading the country and all. I think I'm still pretty much traumatized by the experience that I had before. And just expecting that open the door and bring them in and all problems will be resolved. I mean, that to me is really unproductive, and really limiting. So these authors, I hear from them. Some of them are my personal friends. They write to me, and you could hear that these really aspiring scholars, writers, poets, they're struggling really hard to basically to feel like welcoming enough in a new situation, new position, so they could produce and write, which is.
We're gonna go ahead until 11:15, and there's 3 more questions. So if you can answer them as concisely as you wish, so that we can get through them. There is a question by Anand Patel. Islam is far more orthodox in Afghanistan than Pakistan. For example, women can get PhD in Pakistan. Do the Taliban realize that their mentors have one policy for Afghanistan and another for themselves?
Oh, that's a great question itself. Yeah, I think that this is something to think about, but I think they probably already talked about those things. The Pakistanis, their mentors, you know, they probably have already resolved those issues with the Taliban. And the other thing is that the Taliban are probably their reading of Islam and women and the status of women in Islam is probably as very, very restricted, but not the people in Afghanistan. I mean, in the last 20 years or so, a vast majority of the students in Afghan universities were women. And that it has to be acknowledged one way or another, despite all the problems that we talked about in my presentation, I alluded to. I think one thing is clear. I mean, Afghan women really came a long way, and in different a variety of disciplines. I remember one time, decades ago, Afghans were sort of like presenting models across the border to Pakistani women to follow, but now it's the reverse. And again, it's a political thing. I think the Taliban know this, and but the problem with the Taliban is that if they change, they are no longer Taliban anymore. You know, and if they don't change, then of course, even their mentors cannot really pressure them as such. So it's a very delicate situation that they are in. I think there are certain groups within the Taliban who probably want to have some sort of a semblance of change to show off, but the vast majority of them are still pretty much prisoners of the old thinking, and that itself is also, of course, a product of the non-ideological factors, and it's a lot more political and economic than anything else.
Thank you. And there's, if we can get to the following three questions,
Please.
And I'd like to thank our audience. Probably at this point, no more questions we can do justice to. Murtaza Mandagar Hassani, following Munazza's questions, to what extent do you think the Afghan scholars and their intellectual efforts assist in developing a new formula or political system to best suiting Afghanistan society? To what do you think the Afghan intellectuals are actively involved in reimagining Afghanistan towards changing the situation?
That's a very difficult question in many ways, because of the fact that the situation has been so fluid in Afghanistan, and the fall of the Afghani government was so sudden in so many different ways. Even though, I mean, the society was really in a state that everybody knew that it was combustible. It was not going to be the same as before. But I think the Afghans, especially Afghan intellectuals, I think are still in a state of shock. I think we're all damaged intellectually, and some of us physically, and in many ways. We are still thinking that how we are in the process of gathering or strengthening and thinking about the future as such. It's not an easy thing to see for 20 years being fed by the greatest democracy in the world, that how wonderful things could be, and then suddenly find yourself in the claws of this really terrorist group. And it really the shock has been amazing to many of us. So I think time will tell, I think. But what I would suggest is that if we Afghan intellectuals and writers and poets fall into the trap of I would say ethnicity and language and all the Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, and all these kind of contradictions, and I think we'll all end up not producing anything or thinking positively about anything or productively about anything. So the first thing I would say is to think critically, not to evade from the problem as they appear, but at the same time also not fall into a trap, really. That and I think nothing will serve the Taliban more than to see Afghan intellectuals infighting among each other and not thinking creatively about the future.
Thank you. And there's a question by Professor Susanna Olszewska. Thank you for your wonderful insights, Professor Ahmadi. Your point about the need to critique Orientalist stereotypes of perpetual ethnic conflict is very well taken. However, As researchers, how do we do justice to those subaltern voices that you wish to amplify, who themselves are convinced by decades of bitter experiences that ethnic conflict is one of the major fault lines of Afghanistan?
Thank you, Susanna. It's great to hear you, of course, posing the question. I think it's a major challenge. I think it's an intellectual challenge that we are facing. It's a critical challenge that Afghans face in general. And then again, of course, the question also appears that who am I, basically, to enlighten the subaltern, but and tell him or her what to think. But on the other hand, we cannot simply put the question aside and not deal with. I think one of the reasons that we think is still within this box, which is pretty much ethnic driven or yeah, basically ethnicity driven kind of reading of Afghan situation, is that that we have been forced to think as such. I think it's time to not necessarily discount it or totally debunk it, but I think critically about what brought us into this juncture in the first place. And unless we think of the problem itself as such, it will be very difficult to get out of it. Yes, I mean, I agree that many people, the question of ethnic awareness has been really on the rise in the last 20 years. The period of democracy, per se, is in many ways responsible for this heightening of ethnic identity among the Afghans. And so if we fall into that ourselves as critical intellectuals, I think we lose the sight of the larger problems again. I think it's to me, it's still the question of Afghanistan is a political question. It's an economic question that we need to think about. It's not the question of ethnicity is there, but it's not necessarily the dominant one. It's and cannot be regarded as such. Other than that, I think time will tell, and people realize that our commonalities far exceed our differences, no matter what. And I think the Taliban they are trying to actually create that kind of situation for Afghans to think divisively, and we should resist that.
Thank you. And I think that there is a last question by Professor Ingenito. And once he asks his question, I'd like to ask him also to wrap up this wonderful session.
Thank you so much, Farid. Thank you so much, John, Professor Ahmadi. This was an extremely insightful introduction to the main problem that we need to keep at the forefront of our meditations on Afghanistan and on Afghan studies and Iranian studies as well. I want to follow up on this by asking you, as an Afghan scholar who teaches Persian literature, and so has a broad and complex window onto the connections, the cultural connections, the politics of the cultural connections between Iran and Afghanistan, knowing also that some of the best and most brilliant scholars of Persian literature, of classical Persian literature, are Afghans who were trained in Iran as well. How do you see the politics of the cultural connections between Iran and Afghanistan? How do you see this sort of imperfect overlap between two separate political entities with completely different spheres of influence, right, in that broader geopolitical map, and at the same time, such a strong shared cultural and literary heritage? Well, how should we keep these two things together, or combine them? How to push back against nationalism and also the dominance of the Iranian cultural agenda, right? But also at the same time, we do need to rely on the opportunities that a country like Iran can offer also to further develop what is Afghan literature and Afghan arts. How do you see this complex overlap of things?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I think I've written about this issue here and there, but I think as much as I would like to have the Afghan scholarship on Persian literature becoming more aware of their own need to have some sort of relations or liaison with the center of Persian literary production in Iran today, I would also look at it from the other side. I think that it is time for Iranian scholars to come to terms with the fact that, yes, of course, Iran is a larger country. It has been a totally different kind of socioeconomic history of the past century or so, has made Iran the center of production of literature in Persian today. That's a given. That's a fact. But to think of that as if Iran has the right to monopolize the sort of the tradition of Persian literary heritage, and all along is to me is really problematic. So I would say that I would rather reverse the order and see how our Iranian colleagues are looking at the material coming from Afghanistan, and I think that's very important. As far as Afghans are concerned, I think they have pretty much acknowledged the fact that if you put aside the Iranocentric reading of the entire corpus of literature in Persian aside, we do need all these materials coming from Iran. And in fact, most of the material produced in Iran are available in Afghanistan. Afghan libraries are 90% or so inundated with works of Iranian writers or works produced in Iran. But then again, I mean, that is a given, that is fine. But how much of our literature, how much of the literary production in Afghanistan today, in the present century, for instance, the last century or so, have been preserved or looked at critically and in Iran? How many Iranian scholars do know what is going on and really in Persian literature in Afghanistan? Not much. I mean, and how many Afghans know about the production of literature in Iran? I mean, Afghans are probably as well versed in literature produced by Iranian poets and writers as Iranians, if not more in cases. But Iranians on the other side. So I would say it's an important one. The cultural heritage is a shared heritage, and that is acknowledged, and it has to be acknowledged. But at the same time, at least in the last century or so, our colleagues in Iran are probably more. I would say they should be encouraged to look at what's going on in Afghanistan, yeah. That's
thank you, and it's thanks to the work that you've been accomplishing over the past couple of decades, and what Professor Arya Fani is doing, what Marjan and Mejgan and Munazza and other panelists that will join us in the series. So this is extremely important to, you know.
And thanks to you, of course, Domenico, your work. You know, I mean, it's really great, and it's greatly appreciated, of course. That you're really transcending the boundaries, really the kind of work.
This is what we're trying to do, but it's hard to sort of keep the balance between what are national legitimate boundaries and the cultural heritage that has been shifting for centuries, but it's important to keep alive this conversation and this discourse. Thank you so much. Thank you. I could stay here for 2 more hours having a conversation with you, dear Professor Ahmadi, and we're done for today. This was an extremely rich introductory talk and panel and conversation for this series. I want to thank all our friends and co-organizers and centers that support this initiative. I want to thank again the staff for the Asia Pacific Center at UCLA, the program in Central Asia, Elizabeth Lester and Aaron Miller, who have been extremely helpful to put together so many different moving parts that connect this series. I would like to close this session by introducing very briefly the next appointment. That next panel is scheduled for Thursday, February 17th, 9:30 a.m. again Pacific time. And the title of the new panel would be Invisible Persons, Invisible Texts. It's a book panel that will feature Professor Zrinka Staulyak at UCLA, Dr. Jawanshir Rasih, and Arezu Azad. I will be moderating the encounter. We'll be talking about translation. We'll be talking about differences in time. We'll be talking about the role, the physical role of translators across centuries and across geopolitical boundaries. Thank you so much. Please register for the next session. I inserted the link in the chat, and thank you again, everyone. Please tell your friends, involve your colleagues, involve your students. This is important series. Please, Afghanistan through Afghan voices. Thank you. Thank you very much. See you next month. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And of course, we'll stay in touch.